Welcome, everyone. Welcome to a discussion about Oregon wine and its greatness. I'm Ron Edwards. I'm the Director of Education for, well, wine education specifically for Winebow on a national level. And I am so thrilled to be joined by some really awesome people who are great influencers in the Oregon wine industry. And so let's start with some introductions. And while we're getting everybody logged in, and start with, well, let's start with Tom. Tom is on my top left. He is Tom Gerrie. He is the wine grower and second generation owner of Christum Vineyards, originally hailing from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Tom's parents, Paul and Eileen Gerrie, founded Christum in 1992 and moved the family west to the Willamette Valley. And since then, you basically grew up, went away for a little while, learned a bunch of stuff and came back, right, Tom? Is that about the way it works without getting into all the nitty gritty?
Yeah, it's as simple as that.
And,
it's as simple as that.
Simple as that, yes. Otherwise, we'd be reading bios for the next 20 minutes, which would be great, but not as much fun as answering the questions. Just below Tom in your panel is Veronique Drouhin of the Drouhin family. Veronique Boss-Drouhin grew up in Beaune in the heart of Burgundy. She decided on a winemaking career at an early age, inspired by her family and also the small circle of women working in wine at the time. In the years since, Veronique has become globally recognized for her work in Burgundy and Oregon. She has made more than 30 vintages in each growing region and is considered an icon in both, I should say, for sure. Welcome, Veronique. So nice to have you. Bienvenue.
Thank you very much, Ron.
Going to the top right, we have another person of French heritage, Laurent Montalieu of Solena Winery, growing up on Guadalupe. Very cool, actually. A friend of mine in northern Michigan who is a chef grew up on the island too. And we had wonderful stories. Do you ever go to Michigan?
No, I'll need an introduction for sure.
Okay, I'll do that by email. Anyway, growing up on the Caribbean island of Guadalupe and in Bordeaux, France, winemaking has not actually been Laurent's first choice profession. As a student in agricultural engineering at the Institute of Enology in Bordeaux, Laurent became friends through their shared interest in skiing. Water or snow?
Snow.
Snow skiing, okay. With a group of students who were studying viticulture and winemaking. He would help with the vineyard chores to allow for more ski time with his buddies. I totally understand the motivation right there. It was in those days that Laurent found his calling, and through many years, he ended up in Oregon, where in '87, he became part of Bridgeview Vineyards, and then in '95 was winemaker and partner at Willackenzie Estate, which most of us have known and heard of. Janie on the bottom, below Daniel. Janie Brooks, is it Heuck or Heuck?
Heuck.
Heuck. Okay, great. Good thing I lived on the west side of Michigan, where we have a fair number of Dutch. Is it Dutch or German?
It's German.
Okay, well, that theory went out the window. All right, so Portland native Janie Brooks Heuck spent more than a decade in the healthcare industry before finding herself responsible for the business operations at Brooks Winery. Struck by the generosity and guidance from the Oregon wine community after Jimmy's passing, Janie quickly realized the importance of Jimmy's life work and set out to execute Jimmy's wish of turning Brooks into a family legacy, starting with Pascal. Since taking over as managing director in 2004, Janie has increased Brooks' production from 3,500 to 20,000 cases, and in 2008 purchased 20 acres that Jimmy had farmed biodynamically since 2002. Ambitious and successful. I love it. Mark Vlossak. He is just below Laurent on my right. Is the founder and president. Sorry, there's noises going off. He is the founder and president and winemaker of St. Innocent Winery in Jefferson, Oregon. Mark's exposure to wine began at the age of 7 when he began tasting wines daily with his father, a metallurgist, wine lover, wine educator, and importer. During his university training, he developed a love for champagne. Me too. Originally trained as a theatrical designer, Mark moved to Oregon in 1980 to complete his training as a pediatric physician assistant. He was inspired to make wine after reading an article in 1983 stating that Oregon was the perfect place in the US to make sparkling wine. From 1987 to 1989, Mark apprenticed with Fred Arterberry Jr., one of the first Oregonians to make vineyard designated Pinot Noir, as well as the first person to make Oregon sparkling wine. In 1988, he studied wine analysis under Lisa Van de Water at the Wine Lab in Napa, California. And I am super grateful that you changed careers, because I have had many lovely wines because you changed careers. In our dead center, we have Daniel Emmes on the right of the picture, and Corey Sumner on the left of the picture. Daniel is the new resident philosopher, is your bio now. He's a production manager is your official title though, right? He is a son of a well-traveled diplomat, speaks 6 languages, will happily engage you in all of them, which is pretty amazing to me, and is newly placed there as a member of the Lozen family to continue the greatness of what J. Christopher has become. And Corey Sumner is the assistant winemaker for the property. And I hear you two are becoming close buddies and aficionados of each other's time and production.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, we have our formalities over. Shall we get to some questions, folks? All right, let's start with Daniel. You're the newcomer to the Oregon wine industry, not to wine. You've worked in it for quite a while now with Lozen Brothers internationally. But you moved there this year, right?
Yes.
And yep, and you're now there full time. So what's grabbed your attention about Willamette Valley? You've been quite a few places. You've seen a lot of things. You traveled a lot with your father. What's impressed you the most? Is it the people, the vineyards, the wines? What's grabbed your attention?
Here in Oregon, I like the personalities of the people here. It's great personalities, very nice people, also great spirit, winemaking wise. It's also the place and the wines. It's a beautiful country. It's these rolling hills here in Oregon, very beautiful, picturesque landscape. And of course, the Pinot Noir that kind of brought me here through my uncle, through Gerrie. But I also see that this place can do so much more. I've been to this Chardonnay tasting just when I arrived here, and beautiful Chardonnays that are produced in this area. But there's also potential for a lot of other cool climate varieties here that I see. So, for example, I also tasted Auxerroirs that were pretty nice. So I think this whole region has a great potential, and yeah. So this was kind of what was driving me here, as well as my uncle. He offered it to me to come over here because I did a harvest in 2017 and 2019 here at J. Christopher. And yeah, this was kind of the feeling I got here. Unfortunately, I haven't had that much opportunity in the past 2 months to explore Oregon as we were locked down. I would have loved to visit more wineries and to visit the country, but yeah, unfortunately, we are all in this together here, and I didn't have the opportunity right away. But so far, so good, and I'm looking forward. I will be here for a few years, so I'm looking forward to exploring the area, the US, and yeah, I'm curious.
Yeah, I think your curiosity will be more than satisfied by the time you're done. It is indeed a world-class place to grow and make wine, and I think the rest of our conversation is going to lead that direction. And I started the conversation with you, and then I'm moving to Veronique, because when we have people with a completely different background, European or otherwise, who come to a new wine region with their own ideas of wine and what is proper or improper, I think it's very interesting to see how they react to the reality that they find. And so let's move to Veronique. And so you have a very unique perspective on Pinot Noir wines. Your family history is based on wines grown in calcareous soils with all kinds of long-standing history. you now have Domaine Drouhin wines based on volcanic origin. How does Pinot Noir express itself differently in the Gerrie soils than in those calcareous soils where you are right now? And by the way, thank you for staying up late and giving up family time to have this conversation with us.
Oh, no, it's absolutely my pleasure. Well, thank you for the question. I have to say that 33 years ago, that was this huge surprise for us. Arriving in this area, we knew the Pinot was really good, but it was unbelievable to see how different the soils were from Burgundy. As you said, I come from this region where we talk about limestone and marl, and Oregon is about volcanic. And I think Pinot Noir has this extraordinary availability to adapt to the place that it is growing. So it speaks of its place. It's one of the few, I think, varieties that can speak of its place amazingly well. So the Gerrie soil, the way we saw it at the beginning, but it has been confirmed over the years because now it's 32 years, gives a Pinot Noir with, to me, an amazing texture, beautiful color that is quite consistent over the years, which is not the case always in Burgundy. But the texture in the wine is quite unique. There's a touch of spiciness that I did discover there, and I was wondering if it was just that vintage, but after 30 years, you get it consistently also. The ability of the wine to age, that is something we had no idea. How was Oregon Pinot aging? That was a question we got a lot back then. And we would say, well, we think with our experience, the wines may have 8 to 10 years of aging potential. But now that we turn around and we taste all the wines that we've made over these 30 vintages, they have an unbelievable ability to age. So the Gerrie soil, not only the Gerrie soil, but certainly the Gerrie soil has all the elements to make an elegant wine that ages very well and that tastes like Pinot Noir. So a big discovery. And I would also add that it is fascinating time for us, like the monks probably in the middle of the 12th century, because we are defining our terroir. Everywhere there's terroir, but you don't know them until you make wine. So we reveal the messages from the soil, and it's over time that you get to know them better and better. So we're nailing down to those more specific terroir on everywhere, but of course for us on DDO. Extraordinary time to live.
Yeah, I'd love that. And we're going to explore that exact thought with a couple of different perspectives from different regions. And we're going to explore the ageability again with Tom later in the conversation for that exact reason, because when we start talking about regions that are respected as great winemaking regions that produce quote unquote great world-class wines, one of the factors almost always is ageability. Will this wine stand the test of time? And often in the mind of some wine experts or maybe people who are jaded, real ageability may not exist in their minds in the New World. And I just don't agree with that in any way, shape, or form. I've seen too many great examples of not only Pinot Noir from Willamette Valley, but other regions that make wines that age really well. So I think it's an essential conversation. I'm glad you already brought it up. And Laurent, let's talk about a little bit more, because so far we've sort of focused on Willamette Valley, and your beginnings at Solena were more broad than Willamette Valley. You had wines coming in from the other appellations. So I would love it if you would sort of expand the realm of thought for most Oregon wine fans beyond Willamette Valley, and maybe exclusively Pinot Noir, and think about the commitments and talk about the commitments you made to other regions and perhaps even other varieties.
No, absolutely. Thanks for the opportunity to speak a little bit about where I started in Oregon, which was in the southern part of the state of Oregon. Unfortunately, I cannot pronounce it very well, so it's that area next to California. But you know, I was fortunate enough to start there. Love some of the microclimates, and you know, for the longest time, of course, Pinot Noir is what has been the main variety of Oregon and still is. And so we have seen pockets of Pinot Noir, as Veronique was saying, that are describing different characteristics of Pinot Noir throughout the state of Oregon. Where I started, we were at 1,500 feet elevation, and we had river rock. So, you know, you were looking at something that from the vineyard standpoint looked a lot more to the galets of Châteauneuf-du-Pape than anything else that we see here in the valley, but with very distinct aromatics producing Pinot Noir. So I think that's what's been really fun, is that throughout the state of Oregon, you have pockets where Pinot Noir can do very, very well. And we are still in the pursuit of those areas, trying to figure out how to express those characteristics with Pinot Noir in particular. And I think just those quick apartés, in that sense, Oregon has become kind of the leader of sustainability, biodynamic practices, organic, being as gentle as possible on the earth so we can have that sense of place. So that's something that has become quite Oregonian, and you see it throughout the state where we are trying to be as gentle as possible on Mother Nature, but most importantly on our soil that make our wine. So we are diligent on trying to make a wine that has a sense of place. And then briefly, of course, I think that hopefully a lot of the people that are listening to us have had the opportunity to try the diversity of varieties that we are now seeing through the state of Oregon. I had the good fortune of making Zinfandel from the Applegate Valley, which is again in the south part of the state of Oregon. Rogue Valley tends to be a little bit of a warmer climate, so you have interesting varieties as more Spanish, Italian varieties that are being grown there. And I think a lot of people have known Abucila, for example, in the Roseburg area with the Tempranillo and other interesting variety that the Jones family is growing down there. So it's really exciting. But going back to Pinot Noir, just in the middle of the state in Douglas County, which is near Roseburg, you have a great volcanic origin manifestation with the Red Hills of Douglas County that looks almost like the soil that we have in the Willamette Valley, and is really expressing Pinot Noir in a very different way. So I think it's pretty exciting for us to still learn where Pinot Noir can be grown very well in the whole state of Oregon.
Yeah, and the world's changing, and we know that it's not going to stay constant. Sometimes we think speak to someone in the Mosel, the world changing is not such a bad thing. It's ripe now, and then you speak to somebody where it's already warm and it's not so great. But yeah, thank you for that overview, because I think it is important for people to look at Oregon as a whole and entertain the entire state, even if Willamette Valley is the star of the show. And by the way, I wanted to remind the audience, if I could actually use words today, that'd be fabulous, that the Q&A section is where you can ask questions for the panel. I'll try to get to as many of them as possible. And you can load them up there, and we'll get to them as we go. And then towards the end as well, we'll come back to questions. So let's move on to another question. And this one is from Mark. Mark's history with Shea Vineyard is well noted. So you've been working with that vineyard for decades. You're 21 years of continual relationship with at least one part of it through the years. Walk us through why this vineyard is one of those places in Willamette Valley that we want to talk about, we always talk about, because perhaps it is one of the, if we were going to start putting in designations of the great vineyard sites like other places in the world have, certainly Shea would have to become in that conversation. So give us some background on why that might be.
Well, I mean, I can give you a lot of didactic reasons, and I will, but for me, it's really about that I love the site. I think the wines are really interesting. I've spent a lot of time over, 2.5 decades in Burgundy, traveling, tasting the terroirs, seeing how, as you go up and down the Côte d'Or, how things change, how flavors change, how as you go up and down the hill, things change. And the question really is, why are Grand Crus Grand Cru? And the rationale for that in Burgundy, I think, has appropriate similarity in Oregon. So why is a Grand Cru a Grand Cru? I think the most important thing is that it's very consistent. That in the really difficult years, when it rains and is cold and you have trouble, the Grand Crus just consistently produce better wine. That consistency is very valued, especially in Burgundy, because the vintages can just be all over the board. I haven't been to Burgundy at harvest, but I have friends that have gone and said that they could hardly believe that people could make wine out of some of the stuff they saw come out of the vineyard. So that consistency, that ability of that site to ripen year after year is important. The second thing, which is really close to my heart, is the complexity of Pinot Noir when it comes from a really great site. And in that realm, it really, when you think about why is great Pinot Noir great, it's not because it's more tannic, or it has more color, or it has more fruit, or it has A, B, or C, because great vineyards in Volnay will be very different in their profile than great vineyards in the next village, Pomar. They're completely different, but it is that complexity, diversity, the breadth of flavor across the palate, then the fact that as you open the wine and you drink it over a period of a meal or a period of a couple hours, that the wine keeps you fascinated. It keeps changing. And if you look, and then the last thing I think that's really important is ageability. I think that Pinot Noir is inherently not like Bordeaux, in that it's really important that it goes 30 or 40 years. But in a way, there are things that happen to Pinot Noir which are lovely and engaging over probably, the first 2 decades at least, and beyond, that are still interesting. Maybe not for me as exciting as they are when the wines are in that 8 to 12 year range, when I think they're really fascinatingly beautiful and layered and dimensional. And I think that Shea, for me, does that better than pretty much any site that I work with. I started out working with Seven Springs when I first started in '88, and I thought, oh, this is a really fabulous vineyard, and it ages really well. And then when I had Shea from the '98 vintage and Seven Springs from the '98 vintage, and we drank the wine at 15 years of age, and someone looked at me, it was a big group, it was a big broad tasting of Oregon wines from that vintage, and said, you've opened the wrong bottle. There's no way that this is 15 years old. It just isn't. And I'm like, look at the glass. I don't use this glass. I haven't used it. I mean, it is that same age. And they were like, that's amazing, because the wine just has freshness and vibrancy. So, beyond passion, I think you can come up with irrational reasons why Shea is really interesting. But I'll rest on the fact that, to me, it's worked really well. And I would add, the only other thing I would add is that I actually made Shea now for 26 years, because I made it when I was the winemaker at Panther Creek from the first vintage in '94 that had ever produced the wine. So I did the vintages from '94 through '99 at Panther Creek, and then started also at St. Innocent in '88. So I've literally watched the vineyard from the very beginning and the first crop, we would call that a full crop in the 5th year, but in that year it was a crop filler. It was 0.6 tons per acre. It was nuts,
Well,
How's that?
that's great. It's really great. And it's all the non-scientific experiential reality data. We could address, well, the soils are more shallow, or it's more this, or it's more that. But in the end, the judge of a vineyard is always the wine over the course of time. So I think that's a great way to answer it. And I still remember vividly the day that the sales rep brought to me both St. Innocent and Panther Creek in the same day, and they were both Shea vineyards, and they both went on my list, and that was a good day. And I appreciate the effort you've put in through the years. Tom, I don't want you, no, wait a minute. Janie's next. Yes. We have to bring in another of the rose among our thorns today. So one of your vineyards is in Aola Amity Hills. So what makes Aola Amity unique from the other areas? Because we have this habit in the New World to draw boundaries around things, because it's a great place to grow grapes and make wine, but not always in every area is it a delineation of wine will be different from here. But I think that's beginning. It's well into showing difference in each of these regions in Willamette. So give us a picture of why you think what's different about the Aola Amity Hills, that is ending up in the bottle.
Sure. So a little bit of context first. The Willamette Valley runs north to south, and it's about 100 miles from the top down to about south of Eugene. If you were to look at that, dead center is basically where the Aola Amity Hills is. So it's the most southern designated sub-AVA, but it's not that far southern in terms of the whole Willamette Valley. There are two mountain ranges that flank the Willamette Valley. To the west, you have the Coastal Range, and to the east, you have the Cascade Range. The valley's pretty narrow, and right there in the middle of the valley, there's a couple of different markers. So the sub-AVAs were founded in 2006, and I think you're right, Ron. I think some of them there are definitely have specific markers that make them a unique growing region. I think we're learning as we have history behind us that maybe some of our sub-AVAs could even be further subdivided based on either their soils or their microclimates. But Eola Amity always has had a couple of markers that are really distinct to the kind of fruit that we're able to grow there. And it's a chain of hills, the Eola Hills and the Amity Hills, that also run north to south. It's about a 39,000 acre area with about 15% of it planted to vineyards. The vineyards range from 200 feet up to 1,000 feet. I think the highest site is Temperance Hill Vineyard. And we grow all the great varietals there. We have our Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and Gamay are the primaries. I'll have to throw in a little plug for Riesling. We do grow Riesling there too. But what's really special about this AVA is we are the bullseye for the Van Duzer corridor. So there is a break in the coastal mountain range that brings the winds into the Willamette Valley. They come in through the Eola Amity Hills and push up to the rest of the valley to provide that cooling, primarily in the summer months. But in Eola Amity, we get the best benefit from it. So we will have 15-degree shifts in our temperatures in the afternoons during the summer, which is essential in terms of prolongating the growing season, having better acid retention. So it's unique in that we are the dead center that gets the most benefit of those winds. As a result, the fruit, by and large, from the AVA, it tends to be smaller berries. You have a very high ratio of skin contact to fruit. It produces wines that have really great tension, really great structure. Most of it is volcanic soil, but we do also have some marine sedimentary as well. So we get a nice variety there. But by and large, the wines from the Eola Amity Hills just have really great tension and acid because of that Van Duzer corridor.
Okay, is the airflow through there strong enough to cause millerandage, the chicks and hens issue on a lot of vineyards, or is it more about just a temperature influx?
You know, it's a little bit of both. Actually, I mean, when we built a new building back in 2014, and we purposefully laid it out to be a wind shelter for our guests in the tasting room. It's not pleasant to be out there in the afternoons on a lot of summer days.
Okay, good to know. You know, I think we're going to pause for one of these great questions. This one's easy to answer. You can all just actually, this will be really fun. Everybody come off mute, and you get to vote yes or no on the count of 3, okay? Here's the question. Do you support a law being passed to mandate that Oregon Pinot Noir is 100% varietal?
Yes.
1, 2,
Yes,
3.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was from Bonita, and a great question indeed. And then this one's going to come up anyway, so we might as well sort of like, let's see. I'll take a volunteer who wants to deal with this one. And in the quickest possible way, because this would be its own webinar for 4 days, and that would be global warming. Is it changing the style of Oregon wine? And if so, where is it going? We'll answer it because everybody wants it answered. And then we're going to move on to some other question. Anybody want to jump and put
I'll say that it's making it better for Chardonnay.
There you go. I love it. That's good. We're going on. That's perfect. Okay, Tom, time for you, man. Christum is known for a whole cluster fermentation, so I wanted to throw this production method question at you. The idea is whole cluster gets talked a lot about, but I think sometimes it's talked about by geeks more often than they understand it, at least on my side of the business. And especially the idea of cause and effect, and why would somebody choose to go whole cluster and maybe other options. So, you know, I know you can't give us the master class that would take a long time, but give us the reasons for and against, and you're welcome to promote the reason you do.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you, Ron, and be with all of you, friends and colleagues and men and women I look up to. The choice to use whole cluster or not in your winemaking, it's foundational with what we do at Christum. And we're doing it for a lot of reasons. For us, it boils down to complexity, and I hate to be simplistic about that, but that's really what it comes down to for us. We are looking for a little bit of an extra dimension of tannin, and so, you know, perhaps obviously there's seed tannin, skin tannin, if you choose to use it, oak tannin in new barrels, but this would be a fourth dimension of tannin with the stem tannin. We're looking for complex aromatics. We're looking for an additional component to the spice of the aromatics. We are looking for things that add something like cinnamon and cardamom and clove and baking spices. And there's a lot that goes into the decisions of how, okay, so you've made the choice. You want to use whole cluster. Well, now what percentage? At what percentage do you want to use? And so I think some people tiptoe in a little bit. They try 10, 15, 20%, because I think they're looking for some of those components. I think they're looking for a little bit of an additional tannin, a little bit of extra spice to the aromatics. For me, I would encourage you all to be daring, to be brave, and to go all in. I often love 100% whole bunch ferments. At Christum, our wines almost always end up being close to about 50% whole cluster. And the decisions that go into that are based on the vintage, just lignification of stems, the set, the berry to stem ratio, where obviously the block, the history with the block, the history with the vineyard. We do take into account the age of the vine. You know, I truly believe our vines that are 25 years old can handle a whole bunch to a far greater degree than young vine fruit. Any disease pressure, for example, we actually dialed back whole cluster percentage in 2013. 2013 in the Willamette Valley was a relatively wet vintage. We had over 6 inches of rain in 2013, and so there was more added disease pressure. So we dialed back a whole bunch. It's you know, the decision not to use it. You may be looking for more purity of fruit. You may have it in mind that it's that without whole cluster, it's more representation of the terroir, more representation of the ground. I suppose I would counter that or make a counter argument that, well, you know, the stems you know, grew in the very same place as the berries. It's a very same part of that cluster. It grew in that same climate, in that same vintage. It's part of that terroir as well. And then, you know, what we're trying to do is slow these fermentations down as well. And so, you know, Pinot Noir relatively wants to ferment. It wants to rapidly ferment. And so one of the things that we are trying to do is extend the time in the fermenter. And so we want to pick extremely cold fruit, but without using a cold soak. Native yeast allow things to ambiently warm up and to temperature and allow them to kick off naturally. We add acid up front, you know, early in the before fermentation kicks. And then we are slowly punching down 2 to 3 times a day, slowly breaking the berries open. So slowly releasing sugar over time, slowly adding sugar back to that fermentation, you know, allowing it to carry on. And in our case, you know, for most instances, about 18 to 24 days on its skins. And again, it all comes back down to, you know, complexity for us, and really what we're trying to add to that wine. And you know, a question you and I will discuss in a few minutes is, you know, I really do believe the added tannin component helps lead to greater ageability in the wine. You know, I think, you know, and I'll discuss this in a moment, but I mean, the acid in our Pinot Noirs, the acid in our wines is so bright in the Willamette Hills, so bright in the Willamette Valley. It's extraordinary. And I think that, you know, just a little bit more of an intensity of tannin can create great balance and then also lead to great ageability.
Okay, that's awesome answer. Just a show of hands of the panel. How many and Veronique, you can apply this to Burgundy too. How many people use some whole cluster in their fermentations besides Tom? Okay, I know Mark doesn't. We had that discussion last year. It was awesome. It was so good. I want to give you five. Yeah, I want to give you 5 minutes on the other side, but it'll have to happen later. It was very interesting for me to walk through professional Pinot Noir production at great houses last fall and see the difference of opinion. In one producer, it was exactly what you talked about, but it was bottling to bottling. This one gets 10%, that one gets 35%, this one gets 15%. And it was very dialed into the experience with that vineyard site. And so I'm gonna throw in a question here because we brought it up, and that is Adam would like to know, since all of you are mainly focusing on Pinot Noir, what's the general consensus of the potential for Chardonnay in Willamette? Mark, better for it. Who else has another comment?
Well, I think we're seeing just the tip of the iceberg with Chardonnay was the quality level, because we have now a great material thanks to Burgundy as far as the clonal selection. But most importantly, we've planted in the right area now with the intent to making the highest and the best Chardonnay possible. So that's on the viticultural side. But, you know, I think on the winemaking side, people are paying a lot more attention to those particular wines in the cellar, with doing a lot of batonnage, a lot of yeast experiment, and a lot of things. So I think you're seeing the exact same process that happened with Pinot Noir 50 years ago, with the quality kind of increasing dramatically over the years, and especially in the 90s. We are going to see this explosion of quality level of Chardonnay, which is exciting because it has some of the component of great minerality that you can find in Burgundy, and also some of the fruit and the sweetness and the sunshine that sometimes comes from California fruit. So we kind of right in the middle, and having the assemble of both elements, which is really fascinating.
Yeah, my buyer's perspective on it is watching Oregon come into its own as to what Oregon Chardonnay should be. The first efforts I was tasting, it was tasting like somebody else, like me wearing my father's clothes kind of situation. The wine didn't fit what it felt like it should be at the beginning of what I was experiencing, and more of them now feel exactly what their personality matches what I think an Oregon Chardonnay is trying to be, if I can be so bold as to even say that. And Laurent, it is actually your turn for a question anyway, so you can stay off mute, because I would like you to talk about what differentiates McMinnville AVA from the neighbors in a way that we can sort of find that in the final wine.
So that's a tough and interesting question at the same time. My great friend Steve Dorner, that has worked with Tom at Christum for forever, has always kind of teased us about, you know, can we really figure out what each appellation is bringing, and can we, in all confidence, similarly to what Burgundy has done, say this wine is from such and such appellation. That being said, you know, the McMinnville AVA is a very small appellation, and there's a very small amount of vineyards. So I'll speak kind of mostly to the vineyards that we own, which is one of the oldest vineyard planted in Oregon. It was planted in 1971. So we have some characteristics that are very typical to volcanic origin soil. So it tends to have, you know, the elevated red fruit, but at the same time, and I think that speaks to Janie's comment about the wind coming from the Vendusa corridor, we're right at the extreme north of that corridor. And so we also, because of combination of elevation and closeness to the coast range, we tend to be a little later ripening, and we tend to have a tannin structure that is a little bit more grippy. So, you know, typically the wines from the McMinnville AVA have been recognized as having some of the aromatics, some of the delicacy in the nose, but at the same time having a little bit more grippiness because of its proximity to the coast range, making it a little bit, you know, cooler area. But again, as far as the overall AVA concept, you know, the monks had 800 years to develop it, and we've just been at it for you know, 30 plus years as far as really thinking about AVA. So, and I think that was Steve's point, Steve Dorner, when he was speaking about, can we really relate to all those AVAs? I think we're still in the infancy. For me, there's a couple AVAs that I think I can always recognize. The Yamhill Carlton, that tends to be darker fruits. You know, Mark was speaking to Shea, which darker fruits tending to have pretty big structures, and then the delicacy of the fruit that you find in the, you know, Red Hill, Dundee Hills area, where you have a little bit more perfume and a delicacy of tannins. But when it gets to other AVA, sometimes the hand tends to overwhelm the land.
Yes, and that's a question we're going to revisit that whole discussion with Veronique in a few minutes. There's a question from one of the folks that I would like for Janie to address, because she brought up her plug for Riesling. I'm a huge fan of Riesling. I think most wine geeks are, and the idea that Oregon has some fantastic Riesling. So Kyle is asking, you know, is the resistance in kind of the selling of Riesling in the market what's holding back Oregon Riesling, or is it something else? Because, you know, I know that over at J. Christopher, they're mimicking some methods from the Mosel, and the results are really great. So, you know, just kind of address that idea for a moment.
You know, I think it's getting easier to sell Riesling. I think the challenge that we have in Oregon is it's only 3% of what's grown in the state anyway. So there's not a lot of Riesling to start with. I think we at Brooks probably get 75% of that 3% or some crazy amount. But there's about 50 of us that make Riesling in Oregon. But it's such small production that it tends to not leave the tasting room, let alone leave the state. So you just don't see a lot of it. There's very few producers who actually export their Riesling outside of the state. I think that there have been a lot of good measures, like the International Riesling Foundation scale, that are helping people to understand what they're actually going to get in the bottle, about whether or not it's dry, medium, sweet, or sweet. And I just think it's more approachable. That summer Riesling program that Paul Greco started 7 or 8 years ago, when we had 500 restaurants pouring 3 Rieslings by the glass around the country, you see Riesling by the glass almost everywhere now at fine independent restaurants.
Yeah, it's really nice not to be the only one who wants one by the glass anymore. I mean, I felt like I was fighting an uphill battle for a long time. But happily, not only is it by the glass now, but there's a range of style by the glass. It used to be you could only find what might be defined as a traditional Cabernet or Spätlese style. And now you can find dry and sweet and in between, and it's really cool. I think that draws a very clear line. It could be bigger, but right now it's going to be about plantings, and that's reality.
Well, we have some older plantings from Riesling, and we see they produce very, very nice, very specific wines. But I think it's not yet like in this, like she said, in this big scene, you know. It's in the tasting rooms, maybe it's small amounts, but it's not like a huge wave going through the valley. So maybe this is also because of the whole Riesling category is not like heading off at the moment. So maybe it's not a trend right now, you know. But I can imagine that Oregon definitely is a good place to grow Riesling. So I can imagine that at some point this will pop up.
It helps the reputation greatly that Ernie is now in Oregon making Riesling. I'm excited about that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.
That never hurts. So Janie, it was your question anyway, and I'm sure that the tasting room is absolutely helping these wines out of Riesling, but let's move into a little bit of the why discussion. If you don't have to talk to me very long, if it's a discussion about life theory or work theory before Simon Sinek will come up, because I really love his take on you do what you do because of why you exist. And I like the fact that Brooks has figured out its why, and I think it's impactful. And it's not that we couldn't talk more wines, but I think the loyalty to wines has two factors. One, I like the wine, but two, I also believe in the person or the idea of the winery. And so I think it's well worth talking about the idea of choosing to be a B corporation, the idea of choosing to pursue the 1% for the planet. And I'll give you the stage for the moment to talk about it.
Thanks. Yeah, things I'm very, very passionate about that really, you know, started with my brother. When he started producing wine in Oregon, he brought the biodynamic farming movement and was a leader in that back in the late 90s when it really wasn't happening much across the valley. And We farmed that way since 2002, our estate vineyard. And we didn't get certified till 2013. And the honest truth to that wasn't because of the cost, it's because of the paperwork it takes to get certified, and it never made my to-do list until I had some extra resources in 2013. But I generally am a big believer in certification, whether that helps to keep us accountable as a company, but it also gives you a standard definition that everybody can understand. There's standards that have to be met that are published. You know, we use the words sustainable and natural and all these words now in the wine industry that don't have a standard definition. That kind of process really led me to want to become a certified B Corporation. And a B Corporation, you're evaluated on different pillars in terms of how you treat your team, you know, what your benefits are, your turnover ratio and your staff, your gap between wages of your lowest person and your highest person. It looks at your supply chain and what kind of code of ethics you're holding them to, your carbon footprint, how you're actually sourcing things, and it looks how you're treating your environment. It took us about 6 months to get certified. It was a rigorous process, and as a small business, it made me better. I had to do things like employee handbooks and things that were always on the to-do list but were never going to be a priority because I'd rather be out selling and talking about wine. But there are 3,600 B corporations in the world. And I have to say 18 of them are wineries, and 9 of those are in the Willamette Valley of Oregon, which I think really, you know, continues to speak to the testament of how much we do care about our company, our people, and our land in the Willamette Valley. That's been true all along. In 2019, we also decided to become members of 1% for the Planet. So that was a company founded by Yvonne Chenard, with the idea that we all need to pay rent to the land. We all use the land for whatever purpose it is in business or in life, and that if everybody gave a little bit, it could end up being a lot. So we donate 1% of our revenues to 1% for the Planet, and you get to pick and direct those funds to a nonprofit environmental-based company. So we finally picked our partner. It's a company called Kiss the Ground, and they are all about farming and farming practices that have the least negative impact on the climate. So we just actually sponsored a little film on biodynamics with them. We've done a farming scholarship, and we have a couple other things in the works. So really proud that I'm able to direct money directly to an entity that is hopefully going to help the greater good of farming across the world.
That's really, really cool. And by the way, remind me, if you haven't connected with Carlo Mondavi, he has some really great things that he's working on that you two should talk about. So I'll connect you by email if you haven't talked to each other.
Great.
Because he has very similar ideas. Tom, we're back to you. All right. Often the mark of great wines in the world is their ageability. So we're going to come back to that idea. Each person at this table makes ageable wines. Privilege by who I was with to taste several older vintages of Christum wines. And I just thought you could start the conversation. I think everybody probably has something to add here. So if you'll be brief enough to allow other people to jump in, that'd be great. There were questions here about, well, extra tannin make it ageable but hard to drink young and things like that. And my personal take to launch you is that great wines are balanced from the beginning to the end. They just go through phases of what do you love most about them, but that's just me. Jump off on that and talk about ageability and how that's a part of being Oregon greatness.
Thanks, Ron. Well, just to really quickly say, I agree with you. Yes.
Okay, great. Moving on.
Yep, done. Everybody else, what do you got? Balance. Just quickly to say, it's my perception that the intensity of tannin is in balance, and that it will remain in balance and even get better as the tannin will slowly soften over time. So I don't necessarily think that the wine can be or should be or can be in balance at the beginning and then only to come into balance some point later. I think that those components are there. Everything is there from the get-go. And those components are great acid, an intensity of fruit, tannin, everything in balance. I think low alcohol helps. Lower alcohol helps. for the ageability of wine. And so all that to say, Oregon is built for this. The Willamette Valley is built for this. Where I am in the Willamette Hills is built for this. The acid can be extraordinary. I might have mentioned in my first response, acid is equally, at least as important as sugar in a picking decision, perhaps more important. And so I think, the acid here is extraordinary. And I just think that, we're still a very young industry, and a lot of these are really young vines. But I will say that even with that said, I've been surprised. And forgive me, Veronique, but I may be speaking out of turn here a little bit, but I believe most of your vines were planted in around 87. And I've had 93s and 94s that you made that were as recent as just a couple years ago that I still thought had life and I still thought were beautiful. And I think I remember even you told me once that you really liked the 94 vintage. But you got to put that in perspective. Those are 7-year-old vines, 6-7-year-old vines. These are babies. And so I truly believe, to even a point Laurent made earlier, that we're still a young industry. These defining regions are still to come. The personalities and the signature of these AVAs is still to be understood. And I think that the wines are only going to get better as our vine age it only increases. I truly believe that.
Awesome. And we heard Mark's take on that in the idea of a great vineyard. And the rest of the panel, please forgive me, but I feel like I really need to pull this one into Veronique's world because her family has such a long history with Pinot Noir from 2 different places, but also holding wines and experiencing them. So just a quick rebuttal comment or, yeah, that's exactly right, or whatever you want to do in regards to your experience with ageability in Oregon compared to the other wines that I know you've had.
To me, ageability is something we can't create in the wine. We can't create it in the grape. It is there, and so there's nothing we can do. We can screw it up and make it that it doesn't happen. But I would say it's also very much connected to the place. And I'm obviously in a region that not everywhere we can make a wine that will age well. So I totally agree with Tom that the balance of the fruit, the age of the vines counts, but the location to me is very important. Where do we grow? And that is something that we are, I know it's maybe my next question, but it has been a very interesting journey to find those locations that make the wines with more aging potential than others.
It is your next question. I did have a plan by pulling you in. It wasn't just because you should be authoritative on ageable wines as a member of the Drouhin family, but when you move from village to village in Burgundy, you can tell, Mark addressed it. I don't know why. I'm not sure anybody could really scientifically prove why, perhaps, but having once upon a time, I hosted a tasting for just people on the street. And it was Bourgogne de Grand Cru, 1 single vintage, 1 producer. It was Drouhin wines because it made sense. We could have a range. And it was very, very true that as you moved from one village to the next, and then certainly from Premier Cru to Grand Cru, the wines had different characters. They were notably different from each other. So that with context, that's what great wine regions do, right? There's nuance that's transferred from the land. So address that in the Oregon context from, the idea that you now have Dundee Hills and you have Aioli Amity vineyards, and what are you seeing that's different there?
Well, first, in here in Burgundy, when we put the cork into the bottle, we need to make sure that it reflects where it comes from. It should be a Chambol-Musigny, it should be a Volnay, a Pommard, a Beaune-Clos-des-Mouches, and so on. If you think of it 33 years ago, when we arrive, it's a beautiful land. We know potentially it can make good Pinot. We are next to Eyrie Vineyard, to David Lett, and his wines are fantastic. But then you have so many decisions to make because you have this land and Oregon has a lot of freedom for that. So how do I plant? Which clone, which rootstock? What is the density? What is going to be my yield? And then you start to make wine. And then it's 1 vintage and it's a cold one. And then second one and it's a warm vintage. And then it comes a dry one. And then so you make these wines and every year you say, wow, this one is fabulous. And I think it will age very well. Then after a few years, you decide that you will make a second cuvée with the best of your wine. And what is really fascinating is to see where did it come from, the estate? Because you don't make a first selection of site because you don't know them well enough. So you select in the cellar. So you taste all your cuvées, maybe you have 30 different ones of small cuvées, taste them and decide, well, this one, and this one, if I blend them, I think I'm going to make a really lovely one with great aging potential. So you do that over the years, but you always then connect to where did it come from, the estate. And what I find very interesting is that now after 30 years, some of the wine that I choose to make this cuvée, for us it's Cuvée Lorraine, always come from the same site. So it's very exciting that you see some sites that are starting to be very consistent no matter the vintage. So it's not because of the clone, I don't think it's because of the rootstock, it's because of the place. Now at Rose Rock in Iola Emity, we only have 6 years of experience. Did you have 33 years? So I'm a little bit behind with that side, but I'm totally convinced, and I already see that part of the place at Rose Rock is consistently better than others. So we won't be doing this in another. It will need another decade or a couple more decades to go to our system of appellation Grand Cru, Premier Cru, Village, if we ever go there. But we already made a big and a very quick move going from a region, Willamette Valley, to now the AVAs. But I think it will take us more, and maybe the next generation will define more our terroir.
So things of that being reality, and really one site that is I'm sorry, connection may have bobbled on my end. Did everybody catch that? I think it's very cool that you are now seeing that, you know, that one cuvee is always that one site. So that's like, to me, that's like confirmation of uniqueness of site. And I think we're only going to find out more about that. And I don't want to explore it too much because we're going to come back to Mark towards the end with that. But before we go there, let's talk to Corey, because we're going to now take a sense of place, or at least a call to the winemaker. Ernie Lozen's traveled the world. He's quite a savant, always fun to hang out with, and knows a lot about wine and wine regions. And in the process of wandering and Lozen Brothers Imports in Oregon, he made a conscious choice of Chehalem Mountain, which tells me that something called to him there. And I was hoping maybe Corey could put some words to that emotional or physical connection that Ernie felt. I know this is the place for me.
Sure. Yeah. I'll do my best.
Yeah, I know you're not Ernie, but you know, transport Ernie into the building, I suppose, or
yeah.
You've worked it, you know why it's special.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having us too, by the way, Ron. This is a great panel. I enjoy all of you guys' wines. And I'm a little bit of a fanboy right now with you guys. So really cool to be sitting here with everybody and hearing everybody talk. So I guess a little bit of context. Jay Summers and Ernie Lozen went into partnership in the mid-2000s, working on a few wines together. And then as that time progressed, they decided to find a site. Jay was already working with a lot of Dundee Hills properties. So looking towards Chehalem was a really good idea for them. They found the specific site, which is really great. We're just north of Newburgh, 350 feet to 450 feet, a nice gradual slope all the way up on the hill. We have 360 degrees of aspect and 13 different subsoils on the property, which is incredible. So a lot of sedimentary and volcanic soils, and then trying to figure out what clones to put where has been really interesting. And coming in, I've been here for 5 years now and seeing each vintage kind of, you know, we have Pomard in volcanic soil and Pomard and sedimentary, and seeing how those come in. So I think the guys decided that this site was pretty special for that. It's a beautiful site, first off, and then just all the different soil types on the property led to some pretty cool stuff. And then being on that gradual hill slope, we were able to actually build the winery in. So we have like the cut and cover caves built into the side of the hill, which also worked really well. And it's all hidden behind a row of oak trees, so it doesn't stick out. It's not like some big austere building or anything. It's this nice subtle thing kind of built into the slope and blending in with the surroundings. So it's a really special place, and they figured it out.
Yeah, well, the results are clear. Just for the audience's sake, we've kind of defined the Gerrie soils as being the sort of basalt-based volcanic. The sedimentary soils are the Willikinses, right? And we often think sedimentary in the wine world, we immediately jump to calcareous, but it's actually, and I'm going to either embarrass myself on camera or whatever, but it's more like sandstone, right?
Similar, yes, yeah. And there's Willikinse and Nikia soils, and they're fantastic. I really like what we see from them. And I hear a lot of people talking, and you think just with the sedimentary soils, you're going to have more structure and these darker fruits, and it's not always the case. At least on this site, it's really interesting to see side to side. We have Wadensville and volcanic soils that are deeper and richer and more structured, and then and the Wadensville and the sedimentary soils happen to be a little lighter, you know. And so that has to do with this 360 degrees of aspect we have as well too. So as a winemaker, it's a lot of fun, and it's also really challenging to kind of really figure out what we have going on and what we can do vintage to vintage with everything.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, cool. That's great information. I want to wrap us up at least with the planned questions. We're sort of out of time. If you can each spare 5 minutes or so to get to this one. Mark, I was really captivated by your comments that were quoted in your bio about the article, The 5 Great Oregon Vineyards, which, by the way, if anybody that's listening, if you just Google that, the article will come up. And you've already told us about Shea, and you make wine from each one of the 5 vineyards that they listed. And I think that's really cool. So talk to us about one more that you want to feel like is another pet project that really demonstrates where Willamette is heading or has already gotten.
Well, probably have to pick Freedom Hill.
Okay.
I started making Chardonnay at Freedom Hill in 1992. I've continued to make it every year. It was one of the first places that I said, you know what, this California clone that we originally planted in Oregon doesn't work. Let's butt it over to one of the Dijon, or actually 2 of the Dijon clones. And then after doing that for a decade, I went back to the people at Freedom Hill and said, you know, I would really like to plant a much bigger block on a much better part of the vineyard with Chardonnay. And they basically said to me, why would we do that? And the essence is I said, because I'll pay you a lot of money, and I'll pay you Pinot Noir prices, because I think it's going to make a really interesting wine. The reason I think it makes an interesting wine is that it is fundamentally different from most of the soil that Chardonnay is grown in Oregon, which is mostly volcanic. It's actually the area of the oldest sedimentary soils in all of Oregon wine country. It's applied for its own AVA. Hopefully at some point it'll be granted, called Mount Pisgah, but it essentially is about 20 miles south of the McMinnville. So essentially where the McMinnville appellation is essentially the northern boundary of the Van Duzer corridor, this is about 20 miles south. And actually there is this kind of a small tongue that sticks out at the south end of the Coast Range that protects it from the Van Duzer blow. So although it's very far west, it's essentially farther west, i.e. closer to the ocean than 95% of Oregon vineyards. It's not wildly windy. It's cool at night. It also, unlike many Oregon sites which have some set of hills between your site and the sun rising up over the Cascades, has nothing for 50 miles. So the sun that comes up over the mountains hits it very early in the day. So you get this interesting blending of long hours of sunshine, relative warmth from essentially a flat valley below that bathes it in this nice gentle heat all day, but then the cool winds tumbling over the Coast Range, and it essentially is the edge of the Coast Range into this vineyard at night, which gives it that acidity that Tom referred to as being so important, but not the stress of the wind. And so all of the wines from this site have a lot of structure, both in terms of in Pinot Noir tannin. I call it the big boy because it makes the most tannic of the Pinot Noirs kind of naturally. But they also have really beautiful acidity. So you get rightness, but you also don't lose that cold night, that strong acid component, which is so important throughout Burgundy and making white Burgundy Chardonnay that actually have the structure of acidity to balance out the fruit and everything else that's going on. So, you know, the Chardonnay I've made for the longest, I started making Pinot Noir in '94, have continuously made it since, and then I started making Pinot Blanc in '97. So it's actually my largest source of fruit. I have 17 acres that we're all planted for me on an extremely long-term contract because basically I paid for it. And I find that it is that idea that terroirs that are uniquely different from each other is a really great way to build a portfolio of wines. So Shea is also sedimentary soil, but instead of having just kind of silty, sandy stones below it, the parts of Shea that I work with actually have a 20-foot white sand dune underneath it, which means that it droughts out. So it ripens very differently because it doesn't hold water well. Where at Freedom Hill, there's no water at all in the vineyard. You know, like they dug a well and they got like less than 5 gallons a minute. When Dan wants to spray the vines, he has to put a tank on a flatbed, drive it into town and fill it up with water in order to fill his sprayer because it can't get any water out of the place. But it's dry farmed and the vines almost never have any water stress. So somehow there's just enough water, the grapes can go where they need to. And balance is just something that I find, as Tom referred to and others, that's really important in the wine, that you find its own inherent place that gives it that sense of place, that somewhereness. And for me, Freedom Hill does that, not just in Pinot Noir, but does it in Chardonnay. And if you've ever had the Pinot Blanc, it isn't like Oregon Pinot Blanc. It is just a Freedom Hill Pinot Blanc.
Great, awesome. I wish we could keep talking, but I know our audience was promised an hour. We've exceeded that. There's a couple of questions. One's been waiting the entire time, and it really feeds into what you just said. I was waiting for a good moment to throw Chardonnay back into the question. And this one actually was directed specifically for Veronique, but I suppose everybody here on this call has experience with Burgundy and Chardonnay. You know, which area of Burgundy do you think is most resemblant to Oregon Chardonnay, like when you look at it and go, this is good Oregon Chardonnay? And so anybody got Veronique, you start, and then if anybody else has an answer, that would be great. And then I'm going to close us out for today.
I would say it's a mix of Chablis and Meursault. It's not one specific region, but I think we have the vibrancy of a beautiful crisp Chablis, but we also get beautiful ample volume in Oregon Chardonnay. We haven't defined yet exactly the Chardonnay as we have with Pinot. We're still working on it, but I agree with Laurent who said it's very exciting. Great future for Chardonnay in Oregon, absolutely.
Yep.
Yeah, I would say that for Freedom Hill, it's more Chablis Macon because of that very old soil, but that little extra bit of warmth.
Yeah, and I look forward to the future of Chardonnay there too, because over the last 5 to 6 years, I've really become enthralled with what I've tasted, which is great. Thank you very much.
Oregon Chardonnay in Oregon, that's the key. I mean, it's really having our own identity. So trying to compare to the old world is a little bit not the right idea. We are defining our own style for sure.
Right, which is actually, Paul was the person that asked the question, which is why I delayed to the very end. I wanted to absolutely nail and hammer down the idea that Oregon is Oregon before we answered a question of comparing it to Burgundy again. Thank you, each and every one of you, for taking this time out of your busy lives to spend with us. There were quite a few of us on the call, on the webinar, and I know that everybody took some great value away from this about either cementing their ideas about how great Oregon is or finding some new ideas about how great Oregon is. And I wish you all great success as you work with us at Winebow and also as you work with others around the country. Have a great rest of your day. And I guess for Veronique, it would be bonne nuit, no?
Merci.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take
Bye
care.
everyone.